All right. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. I hope you guys are having a good day and welcome into another Buzz Beat. This is Richie, and I'm bringing on two guests today to chat about the Hornets offseason. And then at the end of the episode, we will take part in a fantasy draft of former Hornets players. And we will get into the rules when that part of the episode takes place, but it should be fun. We've done one of these before last year, but I think this one's a little bit more difficult, a little bit more challenging. And plus, we've got a third person, which adds to it as well. But before we begin, if you haven't done so, please spend a minute of your time, of your day, to go give us a rating, a review on Apple Podcast. It's the easiest way to support us. Let's introduce the guests. We've got a returning guest, Gil McGregor. He's the son of former radio and TV broadcaster for the Hornets, but he also works for Sporting News. Gil, you're now in Boston, and it seems like Charles Lee is now in Charlotte. So we kind of just traded places there.
Pretty much, it was me for Charles Lee and some cash considerations to be sorted out later. But I think both sides have won this trade, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Now, tell me about your dad's new book, The Blind Truth. Give me a little synopsis of it. I was looking at it on Amazon the other day. I have it in my cart. I'm tempted to buy it. I know you wrote the foreword of this book, but kind of give the lowdown on that.
I did write the foreword on the book. It's been the process you learn about what goes into writing a book. And Tucker Mitchell, who used to actually cover the Hornets back in the team's early days, he and my dad kind of worked together for some time, months and years, to kind of tell my dad's life story from growing up in Rayford, North Carolina, to playing at Wake Forest and to playing overseas and then transitioning into the media to cover the Hornets during their early years and throughout their time. So it kind of goes through that entire journey. And goes through that as well. So it's interesting to read a book about the life of somebody you know really well, because you know all the characters that they're talking about and explaining. But it's been really cool to kind of learn more about the stories that my dad was telling me, or he's always told me growing up, but just to kind of read it, it has been pretty cool. So, and also be a part of it was especially important and fulfilling too.
Have they reached out to you to do an audio version, to do like the read aloud?
You know, me and my dad actually discussed that at one point, and he was saying, we sound enough alike to maybe I can do it, and it sounds like it's coming from him. So I don't know everything that will go into it, but down the line, it could very well happen. So that's not a bad idea.
Yeah. And so the title, The Blind Truth, so he was just driving one day and he realized like his vision started to go out, and, but very scary to have it happen on the road. Right.
Right, exactly. My dad had vision issues throughout his entire life, had a pretty serious eye injury during his basketball career. So while he did games, wildly enough, throughout his career, he really only had one good eye when he was doing those games. And then over time, kind of lost his vision due to glaucoma. And that was the moment where he realized, okay, like this is kind of happening. And I guess that was like 2012, 2013, and his last season doing games was when the team was still the New Orleans Hornets. He actually never did a game with the team when they were called the Pelicans. So that kind of signified the end of one career. And the next one, I guess, now is an author and still a motivational speaker. And also he's been on this pod too. So
that's true. Yeah. We don't associate with the Pelicans. So
yeah, not at all.
All right. And we actually have a first-time guest, NBA writer for Fansided, Will Eudy. Will, thanks for joining us today. How's it going?
Going well, Richie. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, like you said, I do write for Fansided, so I'm just an NBA staff writer over there. Pretty much my duties are whatever they need from me. So whatever's happening that day, I'm writing wherever they need me. But a lot of times recently, that has looked like the Minnesota Timberwolves, the LA Clippers. So that has been primarily where I've been for the last couple of months. Just a lot of writing on everything surrounding those teams and what's going on with them. And then, of course, I do live in Charlotte, so obviously, some of what I do is going to be focused around the Hornets as well.
Yeah. So we've met in person. Nice to have you on the podcast finally. And before we get into this like fantasy draft, I wanted your opinions on the Hornets offseason so far. I've shared my thoughts on this show before and figured it'd be good to hear from you guys on what the Hornets are putting together. I'll get both of you guys weighing in on this, but Will, I'll start with you. What are your initial thoughts on the new owners and the hiring of Charles Lee?
Yeah, I feel like everything we've seen from these new owners has been very forward thinking. It's been, let's get the organization younger. Let's get people who connect with the players, and let's just get everybody on the same page. And I feel like they have done that by and large. They've gotten great leadership in. Obviously, Jeff Peterson and Charles Lee have a connection before they even get here. It seems like they've worked really well together. And then, yeah, when it comes to all the offseason moves they've made, I mean, they re-signed Miles Bridges. They bring in some good new young players, and I think that the roster is looking pretty good for next season. I mean, it feels like we're beating a dead horse at this point, but if they're healthy, I think they will be a solid team. Now, playoff team, maybe, maybe not, but from what you can do in the offseason, I think they've put together just about as solid of a last couple of months since the deadline as you possibly can. They obviously chose a path and they stuck to it, and I think you have to give them an A for the offseason.
What do you think, Gil?
I'm encouraged. Will, I think, hit the nail on the head talking about just doubling down on identity. And I think that that's an important thing we've seen around the league with young teams that have rebuilt. You see where Houston is now, where Oklahoma City is now, where Orlando is now. All these teams kind of brought in young, forward-thinking coaches that were kind of in lockstep with the front office, and they leaned into an identity and really went there. I think that that's kind of been, on top of health, the biggest issue with this franchise in recent years. Not everybody was on the same page. Guys are on different developmental timeline, things of that nature. And I think that now it's allowed everybody to kind of reset their expectations and be excited about leaning into the youth movement. You have something really good in Brandon Miller. Obviously, we know what we have in LaMelo Ball, so long as he can stay healthy. Same goes for Mark Williams as well. But then bringing in veteran pieces, keeping Seth Curry, Grant Williams, two local guys who have been there and won at high levels and can be the leaders in that locker room. I think that you kind of check all the boxes for what you would want a team building in the right direction. And I think that if they take steps forward this upcoming season, I think that it'll be tangible and it'll be real because they continue to build on that based on the way they built.
Do you have a favorite move of the offseason, Gil, in terms of personnel?
I think the biggest thing is keeping everything together. I've talked myself into the draft pick. I never was really out on Salone. I think that, in a draft like this where everything is a little unclear, you just go for the guy who is your guy. And it seems like there was a lot of conviction in the front office around taking him. And I think that he isn't a finished product. He's one of the youngest guys in the draft class, not the youngest guy in the draft class. And, putting him in a situation where he can grow and learn without a lot of pressure to I guess, improve right away. I think that was big. And I also do like re-signing Seth Curry. Obviously the familial ties with the franchise, but having a guy like him in the locker room, I think brings a lot of excitement, for the franchise from the outside, but also in the locker room. I think he's a great vet to have for those guys. So I think a combination of those two moves.
Nice. Yeah. My favorite's always been the Josh Green acquisition. I know he's not really performed all that well in the Olympics. And I think some players are just made for the Olympics and some players are not. It just depends on the team concepts and kind of the synergy between the players. But I think he has a good chance of coming in and starting right away at the two guard position and playing alongside LaMelo and Brandon Miller as the 1-2-3. Will, do you have a favorite move of the offseason? And you mentioned Miles Bridges. Like, is that something that you like, considering all the controversy that surrounds him?
Yeah, it's a good question and definitely a loaded question. I would say I'm with you on Josh Green as well. I like that move a lot. But I think when you look at Miles, I mean, he is obviously one of the core members of the team, and that's what they stuck with. They said, okay, this is our guy. We're going to stick with him despite what has happened the last few years. And yeah, definitely a controversial move. I think we can talk a lot more about that, but I think that's a separate discussion. Just talking about basketball, I think it's a wonderful move because, I mean, when he needed to be this last year, he stepped up and was a 21 points per game scorer. He was a 3-level scorer, and he really filled a lot of that production that we lost with LaMelo Ball, right? So I think going forward here, having him as one of those 3 or 4 key guys to kind of bolster the rotation, I think is big. I think losing him would have been a big time detriment in terms of scoring power, in terms of playmaking, and I just really like having him back.
What about you, Gil?
Yeah, it's interesting. And like Will said, there's a lot of other things and layers with it. But thinking about his performance on the floor and thinking about, it's one of those situations that, like, if he were to have walked for nothing, you'd lose so much production that you wouldn't have been able to replace with anybody on the roster. And, there's one of those things where it's like, retain him and figure everything out later. Maybe the answer is on the roster. Somebody improves into becoming the player that can then kind of replace him. And now you think about the contract he's on, you can get value in return. This front office has shown that it's not shy about making moves and getting involved in trades. And, if it's a guy who has value as a basketball player, then there are more moves to be had. But with respect to winning, and it seems like, see the team and everybody sitting together on the sideline at Las Vegas in the Summer League, there is a chemistry element of that as well. I know he and LaMelo Ball all have a really good friendship, and you do need to keep your star player happy in some respects as well. So thinking about all those elements that go into it, that's another thing that kind of allows you to cultivate the culture a little bit. And hopefully, for other things, the people that are in the locker room and the veterans in that locker room can help for the other side of things as well.
Yeah, you mentioned culture. Regulator here in the chat asked, "Do you guys like the Hornets DNA tag that's being used?" I don't know if he means like that's the new hashtag that they have, but they clearly have a type. Gil, you were talking about Salon being the draft pick, and a lot of people were a little bit hesitant about whether or not that's the right pick. But everything they're saying about the guy in terms of being a hard worker, a guy that wants to get in and improve his shot, improve all aspects of his game, even though he's more of a project type player. It feels like a lot of these acquisitions with Josh Green and Salon and some of these other ones, they kind of fit a specific DNA. And if you're not a hard worker, you don't compete on defense, you're not a communicator, I think you're probably not going to be considered. And I know the Hornets do have one open roster spot available. And when you look at this roster, Will, is there a spot on Charlotte that they need to kind of bolster and strengthen a little bit? Like what's the one area on the floor where you're just like, I don't know if this can hold up throughout the season?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to the previous question talking about Miles Bridges. I think that they need more in the front court when it comes to just bigger wings. That was one thing that people talked about when they said, well, if Miles walks, there is all of a sudden a big hole when it comes to kind of your more traditional bigger wing or power forward, whatever you want to call it. So I think that's something they might try to look at this season, maybe at the deadline. Not really sure, but and going back to the Hornets DNA question too, me personally, I do like that term, and I'm not sure who exactly started it, but I know in the last few months it's been floating around. It's been something that people kind of have been playing up a little bit. And I'm not sure if Grant Williams had any part in that, but I think that I've heard him mention it many times. And obviously he's from Charlotte. I kind of like it because in a way, we know that there's this certain view of the Hornets from outside of, the organization, from outside of the Hornets fan base of, oh, it's, kind of like a joke of a team and not taken seriously and those kinds of things. And so I kind of like recapturing that Hornets DNA and turning it into a positive, turning it into, no, Jeff Peterson and, all this new leadership we have, they are all trying to do things the right way. And they are all working towards building this into a legit winning organization. People can laugh at it all they want to, but if a winning product starts showing up on the floor, that's all you need.
Yeah, I agree with Will. And I think that, like, on top of that, they're not skipping steps, right? Like, it's not like this one big move that they're going to just press the button and go from, being toward the bottom of the standings to being a perennial contender, understanding that you have to do that over time. And I think it was that video when Charles Lee was mic'd up in practice when he was like, part of Hornets DNA is getting better every single day. And I think that kind of leans into the whole thing of, look, we might not be a playoff team next year, but if we can increase our win total from year over year by 10 wins each year, look where we'll be, by the end of the 2026-27 season. I think that's huge. And if you can kind of establish that culture in the locker room, I think that that's big. When I look at the roster and think about, where there could be room for improvement, thinking about that, the front court depth is something that's interesting, especially given, Mark Williams' injury issues in the past. I think that Nick Richards has been good and shown some flashes, but then after that, is Taj Gibson your third big in that rotation? How much do you want him to play? Are you going to play Tibbs minutes with Taj Gibson? Are you going to really lean into the small ball, with Grant Williams playing the five? What are you going to do there? So, I know Moussa Diabate was a big, pickup on a two-way, but again, how much do you want your guy on a two-way contract playing? So maybe looking into maybe another guy who's capable of playing the four and the five, and kind of playing that similar style, get up and down the floor, be a guy who can kind of be above the rim, be a lob threat, something like that, rim protector. I think that'll be something interesting to see if the franchise kind of has an idea for that.
Yeah, you guys have mentioned both positions that I've looked at, like the 3, 4, 5, kind of all in that kind of area. I know a lot of people are saying the small forward position is pretty light within the depth chart, but I keep going back to the center position as well. I know that when healthy, we've used the word health like 8 times on the podcast already. When healthy, Mark Williams is a starting caliber center, but he has not been healthy, and he missed, from January onwards last season. And Nick Richards is a solid backup, but both of those guys don't really provide a kind of a change up for each other. They're very similar in what they do. And I do wonder if I don't know what the market looks like, but trying to find a guy at the 4 or the 5 position that can stretch the court a little bit, because that's something that Charles Lee has played with a lot over the course of his career. So that's the one area that I'm looking at. Not that, like you said, Gail, like, one move is going to make them become a top, 6 seed or whatever, but it'd be nice to kind of look at that area. And we talk about this, like I just said, like the health. They've replaced the whole medical staff here in Charlotte. I think the new owners saw like a perfect opportunity to kind of just wipe their hands free of anything tied to the old regime. It's early, but let's say Charlotte stays relatively healthy. Do you think that they exceed the 29.5 win total that I keep seeing like everywhere? And maybe that 29.5 factors in health. Maybe they just assume that Hornets aren't going to be healthy again this year.
Yeah, I say yes. I was actually pretty high on them last year. Just looking at the roster and thinking about the talent that was present. Obviously, a lot has changed since then, and a lot has changed for the better. But I think again, when you think about like the level that LaMelo Ball played at last year when he was on the floor, thinking about what he did. There was a Wizards game I think about. There was a Celtics game, that Celtics win that I think about. He's shown the capability of being, a top 25, 20 player in the league when he's out there. And that's the type of player that everybody can kind of fall in line behind him, and he can lead them to victories. Brandon Miller is going to make a big leap this upcoming season based on everything we've seen from him. And then just getting some continuity as well with some of the guys from, after the deadline. I expect a lot of the young guys, again, Trey Mann, to have another good year. So they have a lot of talent on that roster, and it is a league where talent allows you to win. And then I think the teams around them, you're going to play the Hawks 4 times. They have a lot of questions. You're going to play the Heat 4 times. They have some questions as well. You're going to play the Wizards 4 times. They definitely have some questions. So if you take care of business and you can win some games, I think 29.5 is very attainable for a team as talented as the Hornets are.
Does that seem low to you, Will? 29.5?
I would tend to agree with Gil here. I think 29.5 is probably a little low. Again, I go back to last year. I did fall into, the same kind of thinking of, oh, they're easily going to hit that over. So again, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but assuming health, assuming things go quote unquote the right way, I would say they should definitely hit the 30 win mark. Kind of reiterating some of the same points you made, Gil. I mean, there's a lot of internal improvement. Some of those younger guys getting better, guys like Trey Mann, who I'm very excited to see this year. And, overall, I just look at the 2 conferences, and we know that by and large, the Western Conference has been better than the Eastern Conference for many years. Now, I happen to think, given all the offseason moves we've seen the last several months, I think the West got a little bit better. So if the West is getting a little bit better, I think the East is probably a little bit weaker, and it's probably going to be a little bit easier to sneak into that 7, 8, 9 play-in range if you're the Hornets. Now, is it doable? Yes. Is it going to happen? We'll see.
Yeah, when I saw the 29.5, I don't know, like that's the number everywhere in Vegas, but I've seen it a lot. I thought it would be closer to like the 33, 34, 35, but we will see how that all pans out. I can see the range, ranging anywhere from 29 all the way up to like the upper 30s, maybe even lower 40s if you're one of the more optimistic Hornets fans out there. Before we get to the fantasy draft, let's all pinpoint a player that you think outperforms some expectations on this roster. Will, you can go first here. Is there a player on the roster that you think displays a little bit more on the court this season that maybe others are not willing to admit?
Yeah, I'll go back to what I just said, and I'll say Trey Mann. I really like, what he brought the second half of the year. I mean, he was only there for a little over 2 months. You say February, March, April. But I just think he has tremendous talent, and, he didn't have a whole lot of space to properly display what he has in his kind of bag this past year. But I think that put in the proper role this next year, he can be that spark plug off the bench. He can be a quick bucket getter and a guy that really changes the dynamic of the offense. Because of what he brings and because of how the defenses have to focus on him. So I like Trey Mann a lot. I really think he's going to have a fantastic year this upcoming year. And it's been cool to see, the Oklahoma City guys supporting him even after he came to Charlotte. So I feel like it's pretty clear the talent he has, and everybody knows he's going to be pretty solid.
Absolutely. I like the Trey Mann pick a lot because that's somebody who, like you mentioned, OKC, he was just kind of too good to be there anymore. He wasn't going to be able to be the player that he is, or he has the potential to be in that situation because there just wasn't any room for him to do that. So for sake of getting another name in the mix, I'm optimistic about Nick Smith Jr. I do think it's going to be kind of tough for him to carve out a role, just given the way the backcourt is kind of shaping up. But this is a guy who, before his injury issues at Arkansas, was projected as like a lottery pick, and he has lottery level talent. And I think that they are going to really emphasize improving him and allowing him to kind of get back to who he was when he was showing that lottery level potential. So he's one of those guys where it felt like, it's a very high reward pick, a high reward, going in to taking him. So if he can find opportunity, in the backcourt, they can maybe employ some 3-guard lineups and learn one another. He showed some flashes in the summer, but, the efficiency wasn't always there. Mostly isn't for guys like that in the summer, but looking to him to maybe take a bit of a jump, especially because he doesn't get talked about as much with everything else going on in that roster.
Yeah, the backcourt is just filled with a lot of players. You almost feel like there has to be a trade coming with Micic and Mann and Nick Smith Jr. Obviously, you got the two-way with Simpson and Josh Green and LaMelo. Like it is loaded back there in terms of just the bodies. And I'm interested to see how those players, get a chance to play. And Micic to me seems like the guy that like might have the most trade value to a team like a veteran team that needs a veteran backup point guard. I'm going to go a little bit kind of off the map here, not because he's not he's a good player, solid player. He's not under the radar by any means, but I think Grant Williams sometimes gets overlooked on this roster. When you think of the Hornets, you think of LaMelo, Brandon, Miles Bridges, Mark, and I think the versatility that Grant brings with this team, whether he starts, whether he comes off the bench, like he embodies a lot of what Charles Lee wants out of players, like especially on the defensive side of the court. He's going to bring that intensity. He's a communicator. He's obviously undersized, but he's got strength to body some centers, fours as well, and he can stretch the court. He can play out of the post. Like he's very much a connective piece and a guy that does a lot of little things well, where I think, on some nights he might come in and start and surprise some people. So I don't know if it's necessarily like a breakout player by any means, but I think he's a guy that gets overlooked a lot of times within the roster here. So any final thoughts on the Hornets offseason, the Hornets new coaches, new regime, before we get to the fantasy draft here, guys?
I just want to reiterate kind of what we've been saying along. I think there's a different level of tangible excitement, close to and around the team. And I think there's a different level of national respect. They're not necessarily in the spotlight right now, but I do think that people are looking towards what's happening now in Charlotte as something that could blossom into something serious. And we could revisit this conversation, 2.5, 3 years down the line and say, hey, they were planting the seeds during that 2024 offseason. So I think it's real tangible excitement. And I think, fans are probably a little hesitant to buy into it. But I think that, once we're 20, 25 games to this upcoming season, they'll be able to tell if it's real or not.
Yeah, the hesitancy from the fans is definitely real, and I think some are buying into it without even thinking twice about it. But I truly understand the people that are like, let's wait 20 games until we start buying into this stuff. So, okay, let's get to this fantasy draft. I know we're kind of in the part of the offseason where there's just lulls. We've got to find some things to keep us entertained. Gil and I did this last year, Will. We actually did a draft based on uniform number, and it ended up being more difficult than we thought. Now we're doing one based on when the player was drafted. So just to give the audience a kind of overview of the rules here, we have to formulate a 5-man roster, 2 guards, 2 forwards, and 1 big. If there is any discrepancy among the positions, we can talk about it. A lot of guys are pretty much defined in terms of what position they play, but there's a couple on here that I'm a little bit, back and forth on. Also, so this is what it is. I broke it down kind of like arbitrarily. If you were drafted 1994 or before, that's one kind of section. Drafted between 95 and 2002, drafted between 2003 and 2010, drafted between 2010 and 2017, but also drafting a player most recently 2018 or later. So you can draft players that were not drafted by the Bobcats or the Hornets. But there's only a maximum of 3 players on your team that are drafted outside the organization. Again, these are still Hornets players. You still associate these guys with the Hornets. We probably should have made this clear. Like drafting Kobe, like that's not what we're doing here. So that does not count. We don't associate him with the Hornets, even though he was drafted by the Hornets. So Hopefully we have all the rules down. It's not too complicated, but again, a 5-man roster based on 5 little subsets of when they were drafted. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so I can fill out the rosters as we go. And I chose Will to go first. So Will, go ahead. It's hard to see on the screen here, but go ahead and choose your first player here, and I'll start filling it out on the screen here. You'll go first. Go ahead, Will.
Okay, so my first pick is going to be in the 2011 to 2017 bracket, and I'm going to go with the greatest Charlotte Hornet of all time, Kemba Walker.
Okay. Any reason behind that pick going number 1 overall, or just because you view him as the best of all time?
Well, if it's a fantasy draft, if we're doing it in that way, I'm thinking fantasy points, and I'm thinking Kemba is going to put up a lot of points. He's going to get a lot of assists. He's going to get me a lot of fantasy points. So that was most of my thinking there.
Yeah, and I also think, Gil and I were kind of talking about this pre-recording, but there's probably some strategy in choosing guys that were from a draft era that probably, not filled with a lot of great guys. I feel like from the 2011 to 2017 era, not a lot of great guys to choose from. And then you got Kemba Walker, who a lot of people view as the best player of all time with the Hornets. I don't know if I can fully get on board with that. Like he's got a lot going for him. He's the all-time leading scorer. He dealt with teams that just didn't have a lot of talent. So it's hard to judge him just because I think his career would have been a whole lot different had he been surrounded by a better team. He had his deficiencies for sure, but a lot to like about Kemba Walker. Gil, you are up on the board. And what are your thoughts on the Kemba Walker pick? Because I kind of like that.
I like the Kemba Walker pick a lot, especially when you think about the era. I think that's a great strategy to start there. Again, like you said, it's a little bit of a weaker era, so I'm going to struggle at that time. And I think it's interesting to bring up the discussion of greatest player versus best player. Is he the best player to ever suit up?
No,
probably not. But I think about his greatness and what he meant for the city and the franchise, and I think that it's undeniable, especially being the all-time leading scorer. So if you can get him first, you definitely do that first. I'm going to go in the most recent era with my first pick and go with a guy that we just talked about, who I think has a potential to be the best player to ever suit up in a Hornets uniform, and that's LaMelo Ball in the backcourt. So we'll start there with 2020 top pick.
All right. Very good. Actually, Kemba Walker was actually my first on my board because of that era. And I don't know where I'm going to go with that era after this. The most recent era is not the greatest as well. So actually, I'm going to go there. I'm going to go with Brandon Miller. Now, do we consider him a guard or a forward? Because this is the one player that I've researched. I'm just like, where does he fit? Because I want to make sure that I'm not like cutting any corners here.
I put him down. He was on my big board. I had him down as guard forward, so that's not really helpful. But I think it's whatever you think based on how your roster goes. I guess I'm being a little lenient there. Right?
Is there any way I can put him down as a forward and then maybe make a change later? Or is that cheating?
You won't get any complaints from me, but
Will, is that cheating?
I think that's fair game because if we have him as guard forward, that means it's just switchable. So I would say that is within the bounds.
Okay, so I will put Brandon Miller down as a forward for now. I may have to change that later. I do think this might be an overdraft in just terms of position, being the third player selected overall. But I do not like the post-2017 crop of players that I have to choose from. Great rookie season from Brandon Miller. Has a lot of holes in his game, but he's got a great foundation to work with. Three-point shot, mid-range shot. I love his mentality as a young player, just having that that mindset of like not wanting to lose. I think that'll take him a long way. And so the positional debate we'll talk about later, but I have him down as a forward. All right. So the next player I'm going to choose, since we're going to snake it back around, I'm going to go Baron Davis, my favorite player of all time. And I'm thinking I could have taken Gil's pick by that reaction there. And he was drafted between 95 and 2002. And, I just like his excitement. He was solid on both ends of the court, awesome handles, awesome distributor. He could steal a lot of passes, take it to the other way in transition for dunks. Just very exciting player. And I think he was the one guy when I was growing up watching basketball, he's the one that I gravitated towards because those late 90s, early 2000 Hornets were my favorite team. So I've got a guard and then maybe a forward off my board here. All right, go ahead, Gil.
All right. Well, since you took the guy I was going to take from that era, I can take my emotion out of it now. And I think I'll go with the guy who had maybe the best season in a Charlotte uniform. And that's Gerald Wallace, who was in the 2001 draft, selected by the Kings. So I guess that's one of my three guys who weren't selected by the Hornets, but I'll go with Gerald Wallace.
I got to remember that. We got to remember that 3 players can only be drafted outside. So Gerald Wallace, which obviously is a forward. Good old Crash. He was on my big board as well, Gil. I had him. That's what I had. If I didn't draft Barrett, I was going to draft Gerald from that range. All right, Will, you are on the clock with back-to-back picks.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select another. I'm going to go select a 90s Hornets legend. I'm going to go with Glenn Rice.
All right, Glenn Rice. And so he's from the pre-1995, and he was not drafted by the Hornets, right? Is that correct? From the Heat, I believe.
That is correct.
Okay, so that's one of your guys that were drafted outside, and you've got the next pick as well.
Okay, so from here, take a look at my big board. I still need 1 guard, 1 forward, 1 big man.
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and go with.
This is difficult, man. This is difficult, Gil.
One. Give me Larry Johnson.
Larry Johnson. Okay. So another. Oh, wait. Can you do Larry Johnson?
No, I cannot. They're from the same era.
Correct. Yes,
that's
right.
my mistake.
Yes.
Okay. So since I cannot take Larry Johnson, wow, this is harder than I thought. Okay, I need to look at my eras. I have the 11 to 17 one filled.
Yes.
I have the earliest one filled. So correct. I need an in-between one. Okay. Go ahead and give me you guys have taken all my picks.
No, you took all our picks.
It's also true.
I'll go ahead and take, this might be a bit of a controversial one. I'll take Mark Williams.
To be honest, that's the only other guy from this recent range that I would even consider. I mean, I don't. What about you, Gil? Did you have someone in the post 2017 era besides Ball and Miller?
I wrote PJ and Miles Bridges down just as like break in case of emergency picks, but I was able to. Those are my 3rd and 4th guys, like by a really wide margin.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So Gil, you were up.
Feels disrespectful that he fell this far, but it's a great value pick. I think this might be the best player to put on a Hornets uniform. So I'm going to take a top pick from 1993, Alonzo Mourning, or 1992, excuse me, Alonzo Mourning at my center.
Alonzo Mourning. And so he was drafted by the Hornets, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay. So neither of you guys need a center, so I can hold off on my center. You think here. I'm gonna go Larry Johnson from the pre-1995. I think, we talk about the best player, the most, player with the most accolades, but I think Larry Johnson might be the most iconic player for the Hornets.
Yeah.
Starter jacket, grandmama, like when you associate the early 90s, I think this is one of the first guys that you think about. Awesome combination of power, speed, athleticism, good instincts, won Rookie of the Year, 2-time All-Star in Charlotte. And if it wasn't for the back injury, I think he would have had a different career. So I'm down to the last 2 spots with guard and forward, or maybe center and forward, depending on Brandon Miller. I know what center I'm going to pick. I just need to figure out what range do I have left here. So 95 to... I need to go 2003 to 2010, and then I need to go 2011 to 2017. All right, let me just to give my more time to think about this. I'm going to go Al Jefferson from the 2003 to 2010 position. So, Gil, was Big Al on your board?
He was very high on my board, and he was a reminder of just, how kind that 2004 draft was to, I guess connected to the franchise, because there's another big man from that draft, or actually two more big men from that draft that could have been considered as well that wore Charlotte uniforms. So
Mecca and who?
The guy, the second pick, the number one pick from that draft, which maybe we don't acknowledge that he played for the Hornets.
Yeah, I guess I don't really, I
You
consider
don't think
him
of it.
obviously because he played a couple years on the team, but
Was it one? I think it was
it
just
might
one
have just been
season.
one. Might have just
That
been
Dwight
one.
Howard season. But
Yeah, no,
so I wouldn't have even thought about it, but there was a Dwight Howard season. So
yeah. And Al Jefferson is a guy like, it's a lost art these days. You don't see a player like that with the back to the basket, his footwork, his pump fakes, his spin moves. Like, we'll probably never see a guy like that again. And obviously he's one guy that's been drafted outside the Hornets organization, but I've only got one spot left for that anyway. So you are on the board, Gil, here. You've got a guard position available and a forward position available.
This is tricky now. We're winding down here, and just for sake of this, I'm just going to do a backcourt that Hornets fans are very familiar with seeing, and I'm going to go with Terry Rozier, who was drafted in 2015 by the Celtics, and he and LaMelo will be reunited in my fantasy backcourt.
Wow. Yeah, he was on my big board too as well, because I think that era is not a great era, 2010 or 2011, 2017. Not a lot of great players from that specific era, and that's the one spot that I've got remaining. So,
and he's top 5 in all time scoring with the Hornets?
Is he?
I think so. I think he's 5th actually.
Nice. Yeah, those 3-pointers come in handy. All right, well, you've had some time to think. This is kind of difficult here, but you've got 2 spots to fill.
All right, so I need one guard and one forward. For my forward, I will go with Marvin Williams.
Marvin Williams.
Believe he was drafted in 2005, so I think that should fill in for that one.
2005. Okay. And then, so what's remaining for you?
I believe that would be the
95 to 2002 era, I think.
Correct. So I just need one guard from that era. And again, a little bit of a thin category here.
Yeah.
But
I've got a couple in mind if you need some help. But
well, who would be your recommendations?
I've got, in that era, 95 to 2002, I've got Brevin Knight and Steven Jackson.
Let me go with old Steven Jackson. I'll take Stack.
All right. So your roster is complete. Kemba Walker at guard next to Steven Jackson. Glenn Rice at the forward position next to Marvin Williams. And you got another Williams, Mark Williams at the center position. I think with all the constraints, Will, that's a pretty good team. And Gil, go ahead and finish off your team here. Ball, Rozier, Wallace, and Mourning. And then we need someone from the 2003 era to the 2010.
Yeah, that Marvin Williams pick really knocked me back a bit, because I was certainly set on taking him to finish my lineup. He's so solid for the time that he's there. My other thought, which I guess I didn't really think about him, I thought him as a guard forward. I was going to say Gerald Henderson, but I feel like he's more of a guard. I don't know if what the jury says on that one. But otherwise, if that's the case, and he's only a guard, I don't love this pick, but I think I might go with Tyrese Thomas, because I'm kind of running out of ideas here.
What about Batum?
I could Nicholas Batum. That's better. That's way better. And I was hoping to not go 3 guys that weren't drafted by the franchise, but Batum 2008 draft, I like him way better in my front court next to Gerald Wallace.
Okay, guys, I need some help, because I am struggling with this 2010 to 2017 era. It could be a guard or it could be a forward. I had Terry Rozier until, Gil, you took him. So whether or not I switch Brandon Miller over to the guard position, like the only other guy that I think about during that era is Cody Zeller, but Cody Zeller's not a guard or a forward to me.
I wrote Malik Monk down.
Okay.
So he's 2017, I think. So that could be one.
Do you have anyone from that era, Will, from the guard or forward position?
Malik Monk is who I was going to suggest right away. In terms of other bigger names, I don't think there is one. I think he's the biggest known player for the Hornets from that era. Other than that, you have some names like You have a Frank Kaminsky. You have a Noah Vonleh.
Jeremy
I don't
Lamb
know if you
also.
want to take those guys over him.
And
Okay.
Jeremy Lamb is another one.
Lamb or Lynn?
Yeah, Lamb. Or I guess Lynn too, but Lamb.
Okay, I'll stick with Monk here. This exercise was very difficult.
Tough.
Yeah, it was very tough. I mean, I think we were talking how like the first era, the 1995, pre-1995 era was like the best. Like I have so many guys that were undrafted from that era that could be, fit in here, but because we only have, one guy per era, it makes it very difficult. So we will definitely put this out to social media to see which roster wins. But I feel like I helped Will and Gil on their last pick. So I ended up with Malik Monk with my last pick, which is I don't know. I'm not, he ended up being a great player, but more so outside the organization.
Yeah.
So any guys that like went undrafted that you just want to point to before we wrap up here, guys?
Quite a few. I had, in that era, that pre-94 era between, Jamal Mashburn, Eddie Jones, Lottie Divac, I think Anthony Mason, Muggsy, Dell, like all those guys were guys who, if I wasn't going to go with Zoe, I would have gone with one of those guys. But the fact that I was able to take him when I took him, there were a lot of worthy selections in that era, as well as 95 and 02, because I thought about like Tyson Chandler, like had a really great season in Charlotte, and was a big part of that playoff team in 2010. So he's a guy who's 2001 draft pick, but that's a loaded area as well, like Jason Richardson, Gerald Wallace, Baron Davis, all in that area. So
yeah, and like Eddie Jones, you mentioned Curry, right? Del Curry.
Yeah, yep.
Del Curry, Muggsy Bogues, Glenn Rice, Jamal Mash, Anthony Mason, my most underrated player of all time for the Hornets. He went undrafted. Even Vlade Divac from that era. Like, I mean, just so many guys that could have been drafted. The farther you went along, the closer you got to current time, the harder it was to kind of pick somebody that was worthwhile there. So we'll put this out to the audience to see which of us won this one. So before we leave, Will, thank you so much for joining. Let everyone know where they can kind of find your work online.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you guys for having me. So again, I'm a staff writer for NBA with Fansided, and you can just find my stuff again, primarily anywhere I'm writing on Fansided. Right now, I'm over on the Timberwolves. Site is called Dunking with Wolves, and Clippers site is called Clipperholics. So any of my writing is going to be found on there, and you can find me on Twitter at Will C. Eudy, last name Eudy. That's me.
As you say, it pronounced like Rudy. Makes me want to go watch that movie now. But I haven't seen that movie in forever. Gil, go ahead. Let the listeners know where they can find your work online.
Yeah, you can find my work at the Sporting News on our NBA fronts, as well as the NBA Sound System Canada podcast. So both of those areas, and you can find me on Twitter at Gil McGregor with an underscore at the end. So those are the main places you can find all my stuff. Covering a lot of Olympics as that goes on, as we see Josh Green and Vasilije Micic go for their pursuit of medals out there in Paris. So that's what it is right now, and then we'll shift right into the NBA season pretty soon.
As always, guys, we appreciate you guys tuning in to another episode. Moving forward into the next month or so, we may go every other week just because of the time of the year, maybe 2 out of every 3 weeks. Regardless, we're going to try to put out as much content as possible, incorporate more of these like fun exercises in the coming weeks as well. So we will talk to you guys later. Go Hornets.